La question est la suite.
The question is as follows.
Ms. Dancho, seconded by Mr. Moore, moved that given that after 8 years of this government's soft on crime policies, 1. Les crimes violents.
1. Violent crime has increased by 32%.
2. Gang-related homicides have increased.
3. Violent repeat offenders are obtaining bail much more easily.
4. Increasing daily acts of crime and violence are putting Canadians at risk.
5. 5 Canadian police officers were killed in the line of duty in just 1 year.
The House will call on the government to enact policies that prioritize the rights of victims and law-abiding citizens, namely A, fix Canada's broken bail system by immediately... May I dispense? No. A, fix Canada's broken bail system by immediately repealing the elements enacted by Bill 75, an act to amend the Criminal Code, the Youth Criminal Justice Act, and other acts, and to make consequential amendments to other acts which force judges to release violent repeat offenders into the streets, allowing them to reoffend. B, durcir les dispositions.
B, strengthen Canada's bail laws so that those who are prohibited from possessing firearms and who are then accused of serious firearms offenses do not easily get bail.
C, ensure that Canada's justice system puts the rights of law-abiding Canadians ahead of the rights of violent repeat offenders. La période de 10 minutes.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started. And the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Cheer.
Cheer.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Miss Lanceman.
Ms. Lanceman.
Mr. Halan.
Mr. Alan.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Strahl.
Mr. Strahl.
Miss Dancho.
Ms. Dancho.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Harlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas South Glengarry.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas South Glengarry.
Mrs. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Miss Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Generou.
Mr. Generou.
Miss Gladu.
Ms. Gladu.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Miss Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lou.
Mr. Généreux.
Monsieur Genereux.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Van Papta.
Mr. Van Papta.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Monsieur Gourde.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Reddicock.
Mr. Reddicock.
Mr. Morans.
Mr. Morans.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Doddle.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Que tout
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
A.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Anand.
Ms. Anand.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Monsieur Guibault.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Tassi.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazek.
Monsieur Garneau.
Monsieur Garneau.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Chager.
Ms. Groh.
Ms. Throve.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Saint-Onge.
Ms. Cara.
Kara.
Monsieur Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Ms. Ing.
Ms. Ing.
Madame Bibeau.
Madame Bibeau.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Fraser.
Madame Bendayen.
Madame Bendayen.
Monsieur Serry.
Monsieur Serré.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Miss Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenberg.
Mr. Sheehan.
Mr. Sheehan.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Miss Zerowitz.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Monsieur Fergus.
Monsieur Fergus.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Miss Dillon.
Dillon.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Asfassi.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Miss O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Calloway.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Miss Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Miss Damoff.
Ms. Damoff.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Fragascato.
Mr. Drouin.
Monsieur Drouin.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Miss Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Correction, Miss Khalid.
Ms. Khalid.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Robillard.
Mr. Robillard.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zayed.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Alday.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Mr. Chahal.
Mr. Chahal.
Madame Chattel.
Madame Chattel.
Mr. Collins Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Mr. Collins Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Miss Hepfner.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Mr. Norma Hamlet.
Miss Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Souza.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur Fortin.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Monsieur Barcelo Duval.
Monsieur Savard Tremblay.
Monsieur Savard Tremblay.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Blanchette Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchette Jonca.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Miss Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Miss Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Miss Gazan.
Ms. Gazan.
Miss Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Miss Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Monsieur Boulris.
Monsieur Boulris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Matheson,
Ms. Matheson,
Mr. Descharlet,
Mr. Desjardins,
Ms. McPherson,
Ms. McPherson,
Mr. Blakey,
Mr. Blakey,
Ms. May, Sinish Gulf Islands,
Ms. May, Sanish Gulf Islands.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
Able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them. Ms. Collins. Got it? Ms. Collins, did you get that vote? Okay, Ms. Collins, can you repeat your vote, please?
No.
She's on the screen.
She said no.
Contre.
Mr. Varani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I voted using the app, but it indicated I should be prepared to go on Zoom. I just want to clarify my vote was no.
Yes, it came through as no. Thank you. It's confirmed. Mr. Dong.
Thank you, Speaker. I vote no.
Mr. Dong, nay, contre.
Very good. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 116, 116. Nays contre 205, 205.
The motion defeated.
Try to defend that at the doors, ladies and gentlemen.